5-minute Advent podcast based on the writings of Dom Prosper Guéranger, The History of Advent. The name Advent is applied in the Latin Church to that period of the year during which the Church requires the faithful to prepare for the celebration of the Feast of Christmas, the anniversary of the birth of Jesus Christ. The mystery of that great day has every right to the honor of being prepared for by prayer and penance. In fact, it is impossible to state with any certainty when this season of Advent, which had long been observed before receiving its present name, was first instituted. It would seem, however, that its observance first began in the West and later came into the East. We must look upon Advent in two different lights. First, Advent is a time of preparation, properly so called, for the birth of our Savior by works of penance. And secondly, as a series of church liturgies drawn up for that same purpose. We find as far back as the 5th century the custom of giving sermons or exhortations to the people in order to prepare them for the Feast of Christmas. We have two such sermons from St. Maximus of Turin on this subject, not to speak of several others which were attributed to St. Ambrose and St. Augustine. If these documents do not tell us what the duration and exercises of Advent were, they at least show us how ancient was the practice of distinguishing the time of Advent by special sermons. St. Ivo of Chartres and St. Bernard and other doctors of the 11th, 12th century had left sermons called On the Advent of the Lord, which are quite distinct from their Sunday homilies on the Gospels of that season. In the Capitularia of St. Charles the Bald, in 846, the bishops admonished him not to call them away from their dioceses during Lent or Advent, even under the pretext of state affairs or war, seeing that they have special duties to fulfill, particularly that of preaching during the sacred times of Lent and Advent. The oldest document which we find the length and exercise of Advent mentioned with anything like clearness is a passage in the second book of the History of the Franks by St. Gregory of Tours, where he says that St. Perpetuus, one of his predecessors who held that diocese about the year 480, had decreed a fast 3 times a week from the feast of St. Martin until the Christmas day. It would be impossible to decide whether St. Perpetuus, by his regulations, was establishing a new custom or whether he was merely enforcing an already existing law. Let us, however, note this interval of 40 days between St. Martin's feast day and Christmas, as though it were a second Lent. Later on, we find the 9th canon of the First Council of Macon, held in 582, which ordained that during the same interval between St. Martin's feast day and Christmas, the Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays should be fasting days, and that the sacrifice of the Mass should be celebrated according to the Lenten rite. Not many years before that, namely in 567, the Second Council of Tours had enjoined the monks to fast from the beginning of December until Christmas. This practice of penance soon extended to the whole 40 days, even for the laity, and it was commonly called St. Martin's Lent. The Capitularia of Charlemagne in the 6th book leaves us no doubt on the matter, and Rabbinus Maurus in the 2nd book of his Institutes of Clerics bears testimony to this observance. There were even special rejoicings made on St. Martin's feast day, just as we see them practiced now at the approach of Lent and Easter, as on Mardi Gras or Shrove Tuesday. The obligation of observing this little Lent called Advent, which though introduced so imperceptibly, had by degrees acquired some kind of force of sacred law, but began to be relaxed. And the 40 days from St. Martin's feast day to Christmas were reduced to 4 weeks of penance. The discipline of the Church of the West, after having reduced the time of Advent, also relented and changed the fast into a simple abstinence from meat. However, we hear that Pope Innocent III, in his letter to the Bishop of Braga, mentions the custom of fasting during the whole of Advent as being the time observed in Lent. And Durandus, in the same 13th century, in his book on the Divine Office, tells us that in France, fasting was observed uninterruptedly during the whole time of that season of Advent. Please join us tomorrow as we continue our history of the season of Advent. God bless you all.